The wall had been breached for 11 minutes before anyone in the command tower stopped screaming long enough to actually look at what was happening in the streets below. Titans had poured through the gap in Wall Maria like water through a cracked dam, dozens of them, 60-footers and above, lumbering through residential districts and scooping up anyone too slow or too frozen to run. The Survey Corps scrambled their fastest units. The garrison soldiers fell back to secondary positions, some of them weeping, some of them already retreating past the secondary wall without authorization. It was the same as it always was: chaos, death, the horrible sound of stone grinding against stone, as the wall itself groaned under the weight of something unimaginable pressing from the other side. But then something happened that none of the scouts could explain in any report they filed afterward, not because they lacked the words, but because the words they had did not seem to describe anything real. A single figure in a yellow jumpsuit walked around the corner of a collapsed building, looked up at the nearest Titan with mild, almost sleepy curiosity, and then punched it. Just once. And the Titan ceased to exist as a continuous object. This was not a wound. This was not regeneration damage. This was something else entirely, and the men watching from the wall towers understood immediately, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with relief, that whatever this was, it was not something their training had prepared them for. The breach was the least of their problems now. If you think this was crazy, you haven't seen anything yet, because Saitama has just entered the brutal world of Attack on Titan, and the Titans have absolutely no idea what's about to happen next. So make sure you subscribe now, because this story is only getting started. Nobody knew where he had come from. That was the first thing every surviving soldier agreed on when the debrief happened 3 days later. He had not arrived with any supply convoy. He had not been stationed at Wall Maria. He carried no ODM gear, no blade harness, no signal flares, no uniform insignia of any kind. He was just there, standing in the rubble of what had been a residential street 2 hours before the Titans broke through, wearing a plain yellow one-piece suit that looked like something a maintenance worker might put on before cleaning out a drainage pipe. He had no visible weapons. He was not running. Every other living person within half a kilometer of that breach point was either dead, dying, or sprinting in the opposite direction as fast as human legs could carry them. And this man was simply standing still, hands in his pockets, looking up at an approaching 15-meter class Titan, with an expression that the one surviving garrison scout described afterward as bored mostly. The Titan reached down. It was one of the larger ones, the kind that had already taken out 3 soldiers from the garrison's forward unit before they had even had time to fire a single round from the mounted cannon on the eastern perimeter wall. Its hand alone was wide enough to flatten a small building, and it swept downward with that horrible mechanical certainty that Titans always moved with, the kind of motion that had no hesitation in it, because Titans did not hesitate. They simply acted on the single impulse that defined them. The scout watching from a collapsed rooftop 2 streets over had already looked away, already braced himself for the sound of impact, already started mourning someone he did not even know. The sound that actually came was not what he expected. It was sharp, concussive, and enormously loud, like a thunderclap that had been compressed into a single point and then detonated at ground level. The scout looked back. The Titan was gone. Not fallen, not regenerating from a severed limb, not stumbling backward from a grazing blow. Gone. What remained was a crater in the cobblestones approximately 4 meters wide, a fine mist settling slowly in the cold morning air, and the man in the yellow suit shaking his hand once at the wrist like he had just knocked against a doorframe at an awkward angle. He looked at the mist for a moment, then looked down the street toward the remaining Titans. There were 4 more, all at varying distances, all of them already turning in his direction with the slow gravitational certainty of things that have identified prey. And he sighed, audibly enough that the scout on the rooftop claimed he heard it clearly despite the distance and the ambient noise of the collapsing district around them. Then Saitama walked toward them, not ran, walked, with the same energy a man brings to a trip to the market when he has already decided he does not particularly want to go. He hit the second Titan before it completed its reach toward him. Same result. The third and fourth went down in under 30 seconds between them. The fifth had turned to run. Titans did not run from humans, had never in recorded history turned away from prey, and Saitama jogged after it with what looked like mild annoyance, caught up within seconds, and ended it with a single upward strike that sent the impact shockwave rolling across 3 city blocks and blew out every remaining intact window in the district. By the time the first Survey Corps horses arrived at the breach perimeter, there were no Titans left standing in the immediate zone. There was rubble, there was smoke, there was the persistent smell of something burnt that no one could quite identify, and there was a single man sitting on a broken wall section, staring at the sky, looking profoundly underwhelmed by everything that had just happened. Levi Ackerman dismounted first. He stood at the edge of the cleared zone, looking at the craters, counting them, calculating what force was required to produce that kind of displacement in cobblestone and reinforced foundation. His expression did not change, but his hand, the one resting near his blade handle, went very still in a way that meant he was paying close attention. He turned to the nearest soldier and said, quietly, that nobody was to approach that man, nobody was to speak to him, and nobody was to make any movement that could be interpreted as threatening until Levi himself gave the word. Then he looked back at Saitama, who had not moved, had not reacted to their arrival in any detectable way, and was now apparently watching a bird that had landed on a piece of debris nearby. The Survey Corps had survived Titans, shifters, and betrayal from within their own ranks. None of that had prepared them for something this quiet. Levi did not sleep that night. That was not unusual for him. He had not slept a full night undisturbed in years, and the particular quality of sleeplessness that came from processing a tactical problem was something he had long since learned to use productively rather than fight. What was unusual was the nature of the problem itself, because every other sleepless night in his career had been built around a question that had at least a theoretical answer somewhere at the end of it. How do we breach this fortification? How do we extract a target from a Titan-dense zone with minimal casualties? How do we survive the next engagement given current gear and personnel? These were hard questions, but they were questions that lived inside a system he understood completely, a system defined by human limitations and Titan behavior patterns and the physics of ODM gear and blade angle and momentum. What he had watched happen in the ruins of that residential district did not live inside that system. It did not live inside any system he had ever encountered, and that fact alone was more unsettling to him than the breach itself. He had spent the hours after the engagement reviewing what the surviving scouts reported, cross-referencing their accounts, eliminating the parts that were clearly trauma-distorted exaggeration, and keeping only what multiple witnesses confirmed independently. What remained was this. A single unarmored human had destroyed at minimum 9 Titans in under 4 minutes, without ODM gear, without blades, without any weapon of any kind, using only direct physical contact. No Titan had successfully grabbed him, bitten him, or made meaningful contact with his body. Several had attempted to and had been struck mid-reach, the impact in each case producing a shockwave large enough to damage surrounding structures. Regeneration had not occurred in any documented case. The napes had not been the target in most instances. Some of the Titans had simply been struck in the chest, the face, or the extended arm, and had still ceased to exist as functional organisms. This violated every known principle of Titan biology that the Survey Corps had accumulated over decades of suicidal fieldwork. Hange Zoe had not blinked in approximately 40 minutes when Levi finally walked into the research tent that morning. She had every available page of field documentation spread across 3 tables and was in the middle of writing something with such urgency that her handwriting had become illegible even to herself. She looked up when Levi entered, and the expression on her face was one he recognized as the specific kind of barely contained mania that meant she had found something that broke her existing models, and was genuinely thrilled about it in a way that was slightly alarming to everyone around her. She said, without preamble, that the force calculation alone was impossible, that the displacement patterns in the impact craters suggested a concentrated energy output that no human musculature could theoretically generate, that she needed to speak to the man directly, and at length and ideally starting immediately. Levi told her to wait. Irene Yeager had been at the northern perimeter during the breach and had arrived at the cleared zone approximately 20 minutes after the Survey Corps forward unit. He had seen the craters. He had seen the Titan residue. He had seen Saitama sitting on the wall section, still calm, still unhurried, and he had felt something complicated move through him that he could not immediately name. It was not quite admiration, though there was some of that. It was something closer to the feeling a person gets when they discover that the thing they have been fighting toward their entire life, the thing that has cost them everything, that has defined every choice they have made, was apparently achievable by someone else on a quiet Tuesday morning without visible effort or emotional investment. Irene was not a simple person, but this was a genuinely destabilizing thing to witness, and he stood at the edge of the cleared zone for a long time without speaking. Mikasa stood beside him and said nothing, which was how she handled most things she had not yet categorized. She was watching Saitama with the particular focused attention she usually reserved for threats. Not because he had shown any aggression toward anyone present. He had not so much as glanced at the Survey Corps since they arrived, but because her instincts operated on a logic deeper than conscious assessment, and something in her recognized, without being able to articulate it clearly, that the man on the wall was operating at a level that her own considerable abilities placed her nowhere near. That recognition did not produce fear exactly. It produced a kind of deep, structural alertness that she decided to maintain indefinitely until she understood what she was looking at. By midday, Commander Irwin had received 3 separate urgent dispatches from different unit commanders, all describing the same impossible event in the same impossible terms. He read all 3 carefully, set them down in a neat stack, and then sat quietly for a moment before issuing a single order. Bring the man in for questioning. Use no force, make no threats, and under no circumstances was anyone to treat the situation as routine. Saitama, when approached by the junior Survey Corps soldier tasked with delivering this invitation, listened to the full message, thought about it for a moment, and then asked if there would be food. There was a long pause. The soldier said he thought that could probably be arranged. Saitama said that was fine then, and stood up, and followed the soldier toward the command post with the same mild cooperative energy of someone who has been asked to move to a slightly different seat, and has no strong feelings about it either way. Behind him, Levi watched every step he took, and did not put his hand near his blade, but did not move it very far away either. The questioning lasted 4 hours. Irwin ran it personally, which was itself a signal to everyone present about how seriously command was treating the situation, because Irwin did not personally conduct routine debriefs. He sat across a plain wooden table from Saitama in a requisitioned room in the secondary garrison post, with Levi standing at the wall to the left and Hand sitting to the right with a stack of fresh paper and an expression of barely suppressed scientific hunger. And he asked his questions in the careful, methodical way he approached everything, starting broad, narrowing gradually, watching for inconsistencies, looking for the shape of something hidden beneath the surface of the answers. He was very good at this. He had broken trained soldiers in interrogation, had extracted critical intelligence from people who had been professionally prepared to withhold it, had read evasion and deception with an accuracy that bordered on the unsettling. Saitama was not evading anything, that was the problem. He answered every question with the same flat, cooperative honesty, and the answers were simply not useful, not because he was concealing something, but because there was genuinely nothing more to them than what he said. Where did you come from? He wasn't totally sure. He'd been walking and things had looked different for a while, and then there were the big naked people and he'd handled that. What did you do to the Titans? He hit them. How? With his fist. What technique, what methodology, what physical principle underlies that level of force output? He just hit them. He didn't really have a way to explain it more than that. He'd done a lot of training once, and things had worked out. Irwin asked, with admirable composure, whether Saitama understood that the force involved in his strikes had produced impact events that military engineers had estimated would require artillery ordnance to replicate. Saitama said that was interesting, and then asked when the food was coming. Hange did not find this frustrating. Hand found this extraordinary and said so loudly, at a volume that caused the soldier standing outside the door to briefly reach for his weapon. She leaned across the table and told Saitama that he was potentially the most significant physical anomaly in the recorded history of human civilization, that the implications of his existence alone would require a complete restructuring of every biological and biomechanical framework they had built their understanding of Titan combat around, and that she needed at minimum a week of direct physical assessment starting as soon as he had finished eating. Saitama looked at her with the expression of a man who had been enthusiastically approached by many people about many things over the years, and had learned that the enthusiasm was rarely about anything that actually mattered to him personally. He said okay, that was fine. Irwin dismissed everyone except Levi after that, and sat alone with the man he trusted most in the world, and the problem neither of them could solve. The strategic question was not difficult to state. It was, in fact, almost insultingly simple in its framing. They had encountered an asset of apparently limitless offensive capability who had no military training, no institutional loyalty, no apparent personal investment in the survival of humanity within the walls, and no comprehensible power mechanism that could be studied, replicated, or anticipated. Everything Irwin knew about managing military assets depended on understanding what that asset wanted, what it feared, and what it would reliably do under pressure. Saitama appeared to want food and mild stimulation and nothing else. He did not appear to fear anything in the observable environment, and what he would do under pressure was destroy whatever was in front of him with a single punch, and then look mildly disappointed that it hadn't been more interesting. Levi said, after a long silence, that the man was not a weapon. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without drama, as a statement of tactical fact rather than philosophical position. A weapon was a thing you aimed and discharged in a controlled direction toward a predetermined target. What they had here was something that moved and acted according to its own internal logic, which appeared to be almost entirely disconnected from the logic of the war they were fighting. Levi said you could not aim a thing like that. You could only hope it was pointed in a useful direction when it went off. Irwin listened to this and did not immediately respond, which meant he was integrating it into something larger. When he did speak, it was to make a different observation entirely, that the Titans were not the only ones who needed to recalibrate. He had received, 2 hours before this debrief began, an intercepted message fragment from inside the walls that suggested certain interested parties with existing intelligence networks, parties whose concern was not the survival of humanity so much as the maintenance of specific power structures within that humanity, had already received preliminary reports about the incident in the breach zone. They were asking questions, not about the Titans, about the man in the yellow suit. Outside the garrison post, in the open yard where the Survey Corps horses were stabled, and the junior soldiers were going about the ordinary exhausted business of keeping a military unit alive between engagements, Saitama was sitting on a fence post eating a bowl of something that had been described to him as stew, and which he had accepted without comment. Irene had positioned himself nearby, not quite close enough to seem deliberate, and was watching him with that complicated expression that had not resolved into anything simpler since the breach zone. He wanted to ask something. He had been constructing the question for hours, rearranging the words, trying to find a version of it that didn't sound like what it actually was, which was a young man who had organized his entire identity around a specific kind of struggle, confronting someone for whom that struggle simply did not exist. He finally asked, "Did it feel like anything when Saitama hit them?" Saitama thought about it genuinely, which was more than Iren had expected. Then he said, "No, not really. Not anymore." Iren did not have a follow-up question. He stood there for a moment and then walked away, and the thing moving through him now was darker and more complicated than before, and he did not yet know what to do with it. Behind the walls, something was already moving. The military police had filed their first formal inquiry by nightfall. And deeper than that, in places that did not appear on garrison maps, other things were paying attention, things that had watched human military systems from the inside for a long time, and recognized immediately that a variable had entered the equation that their careful planning had not accounted for. The attack on the secondary garrison post did not begin the way attacks usually began. There was no distant thunder of approaching footsteps, no lookout screaming from the tower, no gradual escalation from warning to engagement that gave soldiers the 30 or 40 seconds of adrenaline preparation that was often the difference between a controlled response and a rout. It began instead with the eastern wall of the post simply ceasing to exist, replaced in one continuous motion by an armored fist the size of a supply wagon moving through it at a speed that turned stone and mortar into horizontal shrapnel. The armored titan did not announce itself. It did not need to. It had been operating on the principle that nothing inside a human garrison could meaningfully respond to its presence, and that principle had served it without exception for as long as it had existed. The soldiers who survived the initial impact scrambled into response positions with the efficiency of people who had trained exhaustively for catastrophic scenarios, while understanding on some level that training was mostly about having something to do with your body, while your mind processed the fact that you were probably going to die. Cannons were repositioned. ODM units deployed to the rooftops of intact structures. Squad leaders called formations that everyone present knew were tactically insufficient against an armored titan in a confined garrison environment, because tactically sufficient responses to armored titans were not something humanity had yet developed. The armored plates covering every critical inch of the titan's body made blade work useless. The joints were the only viable targets, and reaching the joints of something that size in a collapsed urban environment, at night, without the open terrain that Survey Corps tactics depended on, was a problem without a clean solution. Levi was already in motion before the dust from the initial impact had settled, moving along the roofline with the automatic fluid efficiency of someone whose body executes combat decisions before conscious thought catches up. He had clocked the Titan's entry angle, assessed the structural integrity of the remaining walls, identified 3 ODM anchor points that might survive long enough to be useful, and begun calculating approach vectors to the knee joint, the only exposed point of reliable size in the armored configuration, all within the first 8 seconds. This was what Levi did. This was the entire content of who Levi was in moments like this, and he was very good at it. And he knew with the cold precision that defined him that very good was probably not going to be enough tonight. Saitama had been asleep in the storage room that had been allocated to him when the wall came down. He emerged from the rubble of the collapsed section of the building approximately 15 seconds after impact, brushing dust off his suit with the mildly irritated expression of someone whose nap had been interrupted by something inconsiderate. He stood in the open yard, looked at the armored titan, and tilted his head slightly to one side the way he did when something had captured approximately 40% of his attention. The armored plating was different from the standard titans at the breach. He could see that immediately. The construction was denser, more deliberate, less like biology and more like engineering. He found that marginally more interesting than the previous encounters. in the same way that a slightly harder crossword puzzle is marginally more interesting than a very easy one, while still being nowhere near actually challenging. The armored titan turned toward him. This was documented clearly by 4 separate witnesses from elevated positions. The titan, which had been advancing on the central command structure, and which had shown no deviation from that trajectory despite cannon fire, ODM engagement, and the structural chaos of the collapsing garrison around it. That titan stopped, reoriented, and focused on Saitama with a quality of attention that was different from the mechanical hunger response of standard titans. This was recognition. Something behind those eyes was processing information, making assessments, reaching conclusions. And whatever conclusion it reached caused it to pause for approximately 3 full seconds before it moved again. Saitama did not pause. He crossed the distance between them at a speed that none of the watching soldiers could follow clearly, and hit the armored titan in the chest plate with a punch that produced a shockwave which flattened every unsecured object in the garrison yard simultaneously. The armored plating did not deflect the blow. It did not distribute the force across its surface, the way it was designed to do against blades and cannon rounds, and the comparatively delicate leverage of ODM wire attacks. It transmitted the entire impact directly inward, and the armored titan went backward through the remaining eastern wall, through the structure beyond it, and came to rest against the exterior face of the district's main storage building 40 meters away. The crater it left in the ground on impact was deep enough that 2 soldiers later needed assistance climbing out of it. Levi landed on a rooftop, looked at where the armored titan was no longer standing, looked at Saitama, and made a sound that was not quite a word. He had seen Saitama work at the breach. He had reviewed the reports, studied the impact data, attempted to build a physical model of what was happening that fit inside some rational framework. Watching it happen in front of him at close range was a categorically different experience, and the thing he felt was not awe exactly. Levi did not experience awe in the conventional sense, but something adjacent to it, something that arrived specifically as the understanding that the entire tactical vocabulary he had built his survival on was simply not the relevant language for what he was witnessing. The armored titan was not destroyed. It was embedded in rubble, partially stunned, attempting to push itself upright with the slow hydraulic determination of something that had never been stopped before and was not yet fully processing that it had been. Saitama walked toward it without urgency, and the titan's head turned to follow him, and in the expression of that face, that half-human, half-constructed face that contained a person somewhere inside it, there was something that had not been there before. Not fear, not quite. Something closer to the moment just before a person understands something they cannot reverse understanding. Saitama stopped a few meters away. He looked at the titan for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, that this one was at least a little sturdier than the others. He did not sound pleased about it. He sounded like someone nodding that a slightly thicker envelope had taken a second attempt to open. He hit it again. This one finished it. In the silence that followed, Hange was already writing, her hands moving faster than her thoughts, and Irene was standing in the rubble with an expression that had finally resolved into something clear and identifiable. It was not admiration anymore. It was something more unsettled than that, the specific vertigo of a person watching the logic of their entire world reorganize itself around a new and immovable fact. But the armored titan had not come alone. That was what nobody had fully registered yet in the chaos of the immediate engagement. 2 kilometers to the west, at the precise moment the garrison attack had begun, a second incursion had been launched at a refugee processing point, a deliberate diversion, a coordinated operation, the kind of tactical patience and planning that standard titans were not capable of. Someone had been watching. Someone had designed this. And the message embedded in the design was not directed at the Survey Corps. It was directed at Saitama. It was an opening move in a conversation between parties that had never spoken before, conducted in the only language that the Titan shifters had available to them. Coordinated, calculated, structural violence against everything around him, designed not to destroy him. They already understood that was not possible, but to see whether he could be made to care about what happened to the things near him. To see whether the one variable they could not control could be influenced by the variables they could. It was, in its way, the most sophisticated thing the Titans had ever attempted, and it had already begun. The refugee processing point at the Western District had been burning for 19 minutes by the time Saitama arrived, and in those 19 minutes, a great deal had happened that could not be undone. The female Titan had moved through the site with surgical efficiency, not the blind consumption of standard Titans, but something deliberate and controlled, dismantling defensive positions in a specific sequence, creating corridors of chaos that funneled survivors in predetermined directions, operating according to a plan that had clearly been constructed with knowledge of Survey Corps response protocols and garrison deployment patterns. Soldiers had died. Civilians had died. The kind of dying that happens when something vastly more powerful than you decides to make a point rather than simply end you quickly, because the point is the actual objective, and the dying is just the medium it is written in. Saitama walked through the burning district and looked at what had been done with an expression that was, for the first time since his arrival in this world, something other than mild or bored. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was something quieter and more final than either of those things. The expression of a person who has been operating on the assumption that the situation around him was simply a series of inconveniences, and who has just registered that the inconveniences were organized, that they were aimed, that something had looked at him and decided the best way to reach him was through the people standing nearby who he had not particularly been protecting, because he had not particularly been paying attention to the fact that they needed it. He stood in the middle of the burning street and was still for a long moment, and the soldiers around him, who had been desperately trying to establish a defensive perimeter against something they could not stop, went very quiet when they saw his face. The female Titan appeared at the northern end of the street. It did not charge. It stood at a distance and watched him with that same quality of deliberate attention that the armored Titan had displayed, that recognition, that assessment, that communication happening below the level of language in a medium made entirely of scale and threat and calculated positioning. It had seen what he did to the armored Titan. It had incorporated that information. It was not here to win a physical engagement. It was here to deliver the second half of the message, which was this: we know you can destroy us, and we are going to keep burning everything around you anyway, because you cannot be everywhere at once, and the world inside these walls is very large, and there are more of us than there are of you, and we have patience that predates everything you know about this war. It was, objectively, a reasonable strategic argument. Against any other opponent, it would have been a decisive one. Saitama looked at the female Titan for a long moment. Then he looked at the burning buildings around him, at the soldiers trying to hold a line they could not hold, at the civilians still running through smoke-filled streets towards safety that the Western District no longer reliably contained. He was quiet for long enough that Levi, who had arrived 30 seconds behind him on horseback and was now watching from 20 meters back, thought for one strange moment that the man was actually going to walk away. That the calculation being run behind those blank, dark eyes was going to produce an outcome that looked like indifference, because indifference was the mode he operated in, and there was no obvious reason why this should be different. Then Saitama looked back at the female Titan and said, in a tone that was perfectly conversational, that this was really annoying. He was moving before the last word finished. The speed was not describable in terms that the watching soldiers had vocabulary for. It was not fast the way a skilled ODM operator was fast. It was not fast the way a Titan shifter in transformed state was fast. It was fast the way a fact is fast. The way the closing of a distance becomes simply the absence of that distance without the intermediate states that should logically connect them. The female Titan had time to shift its body into a defensive posture, and begin hardening the surface of its arm into the crystalline armor configuration that was its primary defensive mechanism, the one that had previously made direct physical engagement with it essentially impossible for any human attacker, regardless of skill or equipment. The hardened arm did not matter. The punch connected with a force that Hange would spend the next 3 weeks attempting to quantify and eventually document simply as beyond available measurement framework in the official record, because the instruments they had were designed to measure things that existed within the understood range of physical events, and this did not. The female Titan did not go backward the way the armored Titan had. It came apart. Not slowly, not in the staged biological dissolution of a Titan that had sustained mortal nape damage, but immediately and completely. The hardened crystal armor and the Titan flesh beneath it, and the shockwave expanding outward in a perfect sphere that put every Survey Corps soldier in the vicinity flat on the ground simultaneously, and extinguished every open fire in a 2-block radius from the pressure displacement alone. When the dust settled enough to see, Saitama was standing in the center of an empty space where the female Titan had been. Around him the fires were out. Above him the smoke was dispersing in the pressure wake of the impact, and through the clearing air for the first time in what felt like hours, actual dawn light was coming through. He looked at his hand, looked at where the Titan had been, exhaled slowly through his nose, said nothing. Levi got to his feet. He looked at the empty space for a long time. Behind him, he could hear Irene making a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath, somewhere between devastation and revelation, the sound of someone whose entire cosmology has just been reorganized by a single observable event. Mikasa was already moving to Irene's side, not because he was physically hurt, but because she could hear in that sound what it was doing to him. And she understood without needing. It explained that what Irene was processing was not just the death of the female Titan, but the death of a specific story he had been telling himself about what he was, and what his power meant, and what the war required of a person willing to fight it. Because if Saitama existed, then the war was not the war Irene had believed in. The walls were not the walls. The sacrifice was not the sacrifice. All the loss and all the violence and all the particular devastating weight of choosing to fight when fighting meant watching everyone around you die. All of that had been, from the moment Saitama arrived, existing in a world where it was in principle unnecessary. Not unnecessary because the Titans were not real or the threat was not real, but unnecessary in the way that a very long and terrible road is unnecessary when someone else is standing right there with a vehicle. The road still existed. The people who had walked it were still gone. That did not change. But the logic that had made the walking mandatory, that logic was gone now, and its absence left something behind in the shape of every person who had died inside it. Irwin received the full engagement report by midday and sat with it for 2 hours before speaking to anyone. When he finally called his senior officers together, he said very little. He said that the Titan shifters had attempted a coordinated strategic operation and had lost both primary assets deployed within a single engagement window. He said the intelligence implications of that were significant and required immediate analysis. He said that the Survey Corps needed to reconvene its entire operational doctrine from foundational principles, because the foundational principles had been built on a specific understanding of what was possible for a human being to do, and that understanding was no longer accurate. He said all of this in his usual measured, analytical tone, and everyone in the room listened carefully, and nobody asked the obvious question out loud, which was, what do we do about the man himself, now that the man himself has just ended in 2 engagements? What years of organized military effort could not? Nobody asked it out loud because nobody had an answer, and Irwin did not offer one, because for the first time in a very long time he was genuinely uncertain, and he respected his people enough not to perform confidence he did not have. Outside, Saitama was sitting on a wall again, same posture as the first day, Same expression. Around him, the Survey Corps was moving with the particular energized urgency of an organization that has just survived something and is processing the survival, soldiers talking too fast, moving too much, burning off the adrenaline of an engagement that had somehow ended in a way that none of them had a framework for. Nobody approached him immediately. Then Iren came. He walked across the yard and sat down near Saitama without asking permission and without speaking for a while, and Saitama did not acknowledge him but did not move away either, which was apparently good enough. Iren asked, eventually, whether Saitama was going to stay. Not as a soldier, not as an asset, not in any official capacity, just whether he was going to be here, in this world, for a while. Saitama thought about it, looked at the sky, said he didn't really have anywhere else to be at the moment. Iren nodded, looked at the ground. The Survey Corps was still moving around them, and the fires in the Western District were still smoking, and somewhere deeper inside the walls, the people who managed power were already having urgent conversations in rooms with closed doors about what a world with Saitama in it meant for every structure they had built. The Titan shifters who remained were reassessing everything. The military hierarchy was already drafting its first formal attempt at an official relationship with a man who had no interest in official relationships. The people who had spent their lives defining humanity's survival in terms of desperate sacrifice and the specific tragedy of fighting a war you could not win were slowly, quietly, at different speeds and in different ways, beginning to understand that the war had already changed, that the change was permanent, and that the version of themselves they had built inside the old war was going to have to find a way to exist inside the new one. None of that was Saitama's concern. He was watching the sky, and the sky was getting lighter, and somewhere in the middle of a universe that was not his own, on a morning that smelled like smoke and cold stone, and the particular strange quiet that settles after catastrophic things stop happening, he was thinking that he could probably find something interesting to do later if he looked around a bit. He just hoped it would be worth getting up for.